it's nuts for us to be fighting each other at a time like this. The railroads have had a really bad last couple of years.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So I wanted to get a couple of railroad workers on to talk about this spat between the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers Union. Both of them represent workers on the rails under the Railway Labor Act. And so, you know, you'll remember back in 2022, there was a potential for a rail strike, and that did not happen. And so we've been keeping in touch with folks on the rails since then, and there has been some real, drama, I guess we could say, on the rails between a couple of the rail unions. And so some of it I really did not understand, and so I wanted to get them to come on the show to help me understand it. So to do that, we have on the show now Ron Kamenko and Nick Worst, both members of Railway Workers United. Nick is also a rank and file member of Smart TD. And Smart TD Local 1473. And I believe, Ron, you're retired. Is that right?
I did, and I maintain my honorary membership in BLET, Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, Division 51.
Good deal. Good deal. Okay, so that's great. I knew that you were obviously a retired rail worker, but I didn't realize you came out of BLET. So we've got two members from the two feuding unions here, and you know, my understanding is that y'all are not going to be biting each other's heads off during this interview. So we'll talk about why some other people want to. Ron and Nick, welcome to the program. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, so, you know, Ron, I guess let's start with you and just explain for us the, just the facts on the ground. What is it that the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and the Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers Union are fighting over? What's going on there?
Well, ostensibly, it's the feud is over so-called raiding on small short line properties, where both have accused each other of raiding and taking each other's members. We're talking about a very, very small number of members here. And also, it's important to understand that under the Railway Labor Act, engineers can be represented by the, quote, conductors union, which is Smart TD, and vice versa. Within our unions, both Smart TD is not all conductors. There's 10 to 20% of the membership has historically been engineers, because the old UTU was an amalgamation that included the Firemen's Union, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen. And then in more recent times, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers changed its name in the last 20 years to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. And so both unions have the right under the Railway Labor Act to represent members of the operating craft, both conductors and engineers. The feud is a deep one and it's a long one, and without understanding the history, it's impossible to really understand the insanity that's taking place today. The railroad unions, we got organized early on back in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. So our unions are old, and they were organized along craft lines. And this is how most workers around the world, when they organize first in the unions, do it. You organize with the people who you're closest with, which is often those in your craft. It had some degree of effectiveness, but it was outmoded over 100 years ago. And unfortunately, we never got a railroad workers union that is a much more effective means of combating the powerful railroad carriers. And so we're still divided up into these archaic craft delineations. And so as jobs diminish, as technology is introduced, as the carrier mounts attacks on this craft or that craft, there is the propensity for the crafts to fight against each other to see who gets to maintain the last handful of dues paying members. And this is not a good model to go into battle with. And so I'll leave it at that for now, but that's like your basic background. This is nothing new. These two unions have been fighting with each other for decades and literally over a century in prior incarnations. And it's something we really, as railroaders, have to consider. Do we want to continue to do this in perpetuity? Because it's been harming us greatly for 150 years. And this is just the latest round of what I call the craft war. It's not good for railroad workers.
Right, right. And, Nick, being somebody that's still on the rails, a rank and file member of SMART, how are your members reacting to this feud? And just give folks a sense, how many dues payers are we talking about? I guess first, let's answer that question first. How many dues payers are we talking about? And then, Nick, how are your coworkers responding to the leaders of these two unions feuding?
So I think the first thing is that I don't speak to anyone who says, yeah, it's a good idea for us to go to war. I mean, I think everybody knows that it's nuts for us to be fighting each other at a time like this. The railroads have had a really bad last couple of years, and they had to shove that contract down our throats in the last round of bargaining. But because that contract fight was so delayed and took so long to get resolved, we're already looking at beginning negotiations again with most of the big Class 1 freight railroads this fall. And so for the two largest unions in the industry to be going at each other at a time like this is creating a golden opportunity for the carriers to insert themselves right in there and make promises to one in order to stab the other in the back. That's what they did at the leadership battle at Norfolk Southern recently, when Ancora was trying to take over. And so, yeah, I don't think anyone thinks this is a good idea. And I think locally, on sort of individual levels, we work with each other every day, right? Like Ron was saying, it's not a clear split of, conductors are in SMART TD, the UTU, and engineers are in the BLE. But that division still does exist to some degree. So I'm working regularly with members of the BLE every day, right? And we work together perfectly fine, right? This war is at this national, international level, but I don't think really on the ground anybody is eager to carry out this war with each other. So yeah, and I think in terms of what are we talking about? How many dues payers? So between the rating issue, which Ron mentioned, which is really small potatoes. I mean, we had at our convention in April, we had a presentation by a union organizer, Chris Townsend, who put up some pretty shocking numbers, which is based on his research. The railroads are down to almost 50% union density from one of the highest rates of union membership out of all industries. Between short lining and subcontracting, we're down to almost 50% of railroad workers are non-union. And so for the feuding to be happening over, properties where there's 14 members, 15 members, 20 members, when there's a massive swath of railroad workers who are unorganized and that the craft unions have failed to go out and organize, it sort of demonstrates the short-sightedness of the whole thing.
Right, right. It really is perplexing, especially when you note the number of people that we're talking about. You know, it would be, and I was speaking to Ron the other day trying to get some background on this, and, you know, it would still not be acceptable if we were talking about bargaining units that were in the, you know, on the order of thousands of dues payers. You know, it would still not be acceptable, but at least you could start to kind of wrap your head around it. But we're talking about units on the order of dozens of or dozen, like singular. So I mean, this is really perplexing stuff, and it's even more it might be even more perplexing to some, like myself, because Eddie Hall was a working railroader who came into the presidency of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen from the rails. He was a working railroader, and while he was not affiliated with any of the broader reform movements, you know, I think just because of the fact that he was just, you know, this a pissed off guy, there was some hope that he would be, you know, that he would be trying to be a better leader than the people that were pissing him off. And so, you know, in your union, Ron, how are people reacting to the leadership of this new, you know, the new president, Eddie Hall, and his actions over the last few months?
Well, I'm not on the property anymore after the last 6 months, so I must admit I'm, you know, a little bit out of touch with just the rank and file banter that we normally would have. But I've seen this before, you know, in my 3 decades or so of railroading. Most railroaders, most conductors and engineers do not invest a whole lot into these sorts of squabbles at the leadership level. And I shouldn't really call them leadership, because this is not a way to lead railroad workers. They're union officials. I hesitate to call them leaders when they are acting in such a fashion. But there's a few things to remember. The craft war, as I was referring to it, there was a time when engineers drew their membership from the ranks of firemen, which were still UTU members, the Firemen's Union being one of 4 craft unions that merged into the UTU in 1969. But today, since 1985, things are even more integrated. So most of the engineers, I'd say upwards of 95% of the engineers that are out there today, once were members of Smart TD / UTU, because this is the union they hired into the railroad as. So when you hire into the railroad these days, it's very unlikely, except for a few roads, that you would hire in as an engineer. You hire in as a trainman, a conductor. And so you're represented by a Smart TD. And therefore, most railroad workers, when they hire in, opt to be members of Smart TD. So that's the first thing to remember, that this feud isn't, I mean, it's all in the family in many, many ways, because just about everybody carrying a BLE card once carried the Smart TD card. So the absurdity of this fight grows even deeper. There's a few other things that's worth mentioning. Members can change at any time. I chose to be a member of the BLE when I came to Amtrak. Prior to that, I was a member of the UTU and a member of the UTUE, the Engineers Committee within the UTU. But I could have changed over at any moment to the BLE. And then if I got tired with the BLE, I can always jack in my BLE membership and become a member of SMART. Nick, for example, right now is still a member of SMART. Once he's set up as an engineer, he'll have a choice: stay in SMART or go to BLE. Or maybe he goes to BLE and 5 years later he says, I'm not getting good representation. He goes back to SMART. This happens on a regular basis as individuals make a decision for one reason or another to affiliate with one union or another. It's an unusual set of circumstances that workers under NLRA and other state laws and so forth don't really have. And so this also is lots of cross-pollination. And once again, it's all in the family. For there to be a fight between these two organizations, is absurd. But last but not least, maybe let's look at a few reasons they might be fighting. Because as you say, Jacob, you're kind of flummoxed by this, and I think so are most of the members. Because this, as Nick pointed out, this is no time to be fighting, especially over a handful of members. So you have organizing departments in both SMART and BLE. The BLE in 10 years, I believe, has organized 2 properties, and these properties amount to maybe 3 or 4 dozen people. SMART has done better, but they've organized maybe 10 properties. But we're talking about very, very small numbers here. So you have organizing departments that aren't really getting the job done. As Nick pointed out, Chris Townsend said that railroad union membership now, if you take all the contracted work and so forth, and all the short lines and spinoffs and regionals that aren't union, we're down below 50% or so. So what's the best thing to do when you're failing? Nations do it all the time. Politicians do it all the time. They start a war, and then you galvanize the true blue BLE members behind the banner of the engineers union, or you galvanize the members, the trainmen, the conductors behind Smart TD, and the enemy is that other union. And you always have enough patriots, if you will, to fall in behind that nonsense and circle the wagons and protect, the home union, so to speak. But all it's going to do, of course, is kill us as engineers and trainmen if we fall into that trap. One final thing. There's so much different politics, and it's very confusing in rail labor. Unions are affiliated to the Change to Win Coalition, the AFL-CIO. The Carmen's Union is affiliated to the Transportation Communication Union, which in turn is affiliated with the Machinists. The Machinists also have District 27, District 19 rather, that represents guys in the diesel house. So there's a lot of complicated politics. The BLE and the Maintenance of Way workers, the BMWED, are both affiliated to the Teamsters. We finally got new leadership in the Teamsters, and it's possible that Sean O'Brien is pushing the leaders of BMWED and BLET to form a united front once again. These two unions have hated each other and fought against each other for the last 10 years. But the leaders of those respective unions, Simpson and Pierce, are now gone, and you have 2 new leaders, and it's possible that there is a move to unite the BLE and the BMWED, the Teamster affiliates. This is just speculation on my part, and I hope there is a move to unite those 2 unions. They never should have been fighting one another, but to jettison this 10-year alliance with the natural ally of the engineers union, Smart TD, the conductors, is the height of absurdity. So it's hard to say what all is actually going on internally, but I think this might help you and others with this, the flummoxing factor. Like, yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes BS at play here that might be propelling this little fight forward.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And, since you mentioned the Teamsters, and that's, another flummoxing thing, the idea that there's 2 rail unions within the Teamsters that hate each other. I mean, it's absurd enough within just the House of Labor generally, but then within the House of the Teamsters, you've got that's just absurd. That's another level of absurd. But you've got Sean O'Brien really, being irresponsible, I think, in his antagonism towards the Machinists, in his, ripping up the no raid pact that the Teamsters have had for years with the Machinists Union, really irresponsible behavior. And that's, I'm very concerned about what that means for the tri-union alliance to organize Delta with the Teamsters, the Machinists, and the AFA. It's very concerning. And so the idea that there's a possibility of the Rail Labor Coalition breaking up, also, certainly not without, some amount of fingerprints from Sean O'Brien, is very, very concerning. And so as we go into these negotiations, I think, Nick, you said they begin in the fall. Remind people what the status was during the last negotiations as far as the degree of rail unity, and what was the expectation this time, i.e., like how many rail unions negotiated in a coalition last time, how many were expected to this time before the feud, and is this feud big enough that there is actually an expectation that the coalition is going to dissolve?
Yeah, so last time we had all of the rail unions bargaining together as one, at least in theory. It took a little while to get there. It actually started out as two different bargaining coalitions that then merged later on into the process. But and I don't want to, it's important to point out that this was still not good enough. The actual unity in practice broke down as soon as the tentative agreement came out, as soon as the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations came out and the tentative agreement came out, and the ratification votes started, because, or even before that, because different unions started accepting the tentative agreement before all parties were satisfied, basically. And they used these nasty little things that we refer to as Me Too clauses in order to try and secure, if there were any gains won from any of the unions staying in negotiations and not accepting the tentative agreement, that would also be reflected in what they got. And so the unity broke down really quickly. And so you had a situation where by the end, there were just a handful of unions holding out at the table. But it was all the unions together, at least in theory, in one big coordinated bargaining thing, which was a big deal. And I think sort of the expectation was, at least from my perspective, from a lot of members, that we had such a big fight that was so public and so got so much attention from people who haven't been paying attention to railroad labor, to what's happening on the railroads, that we could only sort of go up from there. It got to the point where the federal government had to intervene, right? And the railroad companies were taking big losses in terms of public image, in terms of coverage by the media. Railroad workers' voices were getting out there. So I think kind of the expectation, especially because the contract took so long to get settled, that basically we knew that negotiations were going to start within a couple of years, in such a short turnaround. And then given what developed after the contract battle was resolved with the East Palestine derailment, several other very high profile derailments, a lot of attention being paid to the industry and the media, that we could only go up from there, right? And so I think it's a double whammy that we had such high expectations coming off of the back of the last contract fight, that now that's all being thrown away to a certain degree. All that goodwill that had been built up, all of that energy, all of that anger, this moment is potentially being squandered because of this fight. And, these are the two biggest rail unions by a large degree. And so what they do sets the tone for the rest of rail labor. So I think at this point, it's really, if nothing happens, right? If nothing else changes, it's really unlikely that Smart TD and BLE will renew an alliance for some form of coordinated bargaining. There could possibly be a coalition of some of the other crafts working together. Some of the shop crafts, maybe machinists, maintenance away. Who knows? Carmen. That's all speculation, really. But I do think there's an opportunity here, right? The game isn't done yet. And that's what we're campaigning on is this is exactly the time for the existing, officers to set aside all this petty stuff. And I don't say that to just like downplay the rating, but if you see if you look at the social media posts that the unions are putting out where they're like declaring, how dare they, and then they're fighting about whether or not what they're doing can technically be defined as raiding or not, right? Like it's not even clear cut whether, so the point for us in Railroad Workers United is that this is a crucial moment. Our industry is under attack. It's been under attack. We've lost so many people. The unions are hemorrhaging members. The industry is massively underorganized, and railroad workers have seen what UAW workers have been able to win on strike. They've seen what happens when you do like a contract campaign at UPS. They've seen what happens when you have a real legitimate strike threat. When you build up that credible strike threat and you organize and you mobilize the rank and file. And so I think there's a big gulf between what sort of the active rank and file is expecting and what the leadership is willing to deliver. And so that's where we come in. It's trying to mobilize the rank and file, trying to get the voices out there, trying to make it clear to the leadership why we as rank and file members want coordinated bargaining if we're going to have any future in our industry, if we're going to have any kind of secure livelihood. And that's so much bigger than these properties of 14, 15 guys. And really, the best way to organize those properties is not to be stabbing each other in the back over this, but by winning real gains at the negotiating table in the contract fight and demonstrating to non-union railroad workers around the country, this is what it means to be a member of a railroad union. This is what we can win, right? Right now, if there's a non-union railroad worker who's saying, oh, I want to join a union, he's got to figure out which union is going to represent his craft, right? And then he's got to deal with the fact that maybe he's one of 5 guys in his craft on this property, and this union's not going to put any skin in the game to organize 5 guys, in the middle of nowhere. Instead, having an industry-wide all crafts approach that could bring unions to all these properties, in a really sweeping manner.
Right. Yeah. And so, just to illustrate, the absurdity of the thing, like the fact that it's not even clear that what's going on is raiding. One of the incidents that is in question is members of one of the unions felt like they were not being serviced well by said union, and they approached the other union to have them represent them instead. So there was not, at least in this incident, the one union was not going, proactively to try to, it was, people coming to them and saying, hey, we would rather be affiliated with you than the other guys. And, you could, maybe you could make a case that that's raiding, I mean, there's certainly, it's like not normal, but still, we're talking about very small bargaining units and yeah, the idea that you're going to put the entire rail labor coalition at risk because of that is just really not acceptable. And so, Ron, the Railroad Workers United is a cross-craft caucus of railroaders. And, Nick, you said that this is kind of where you come in. The rank and file and both unions are not happy with this warring between these two unions. And so, Ron, what is it that Railroad Workers United is doing right now to fight back against the absurdity of the actions of these union officials. And then, while you're talking, you can just explain explain for us what really should happen eventually. And that is amalgamation and, the creation of a railroad workers union. Because the idea that you're going to have, this property where a union can only represent 5 people in one craft, and you have to organize them. You got to have another election for the other crafts. Is just really, really kind of silly. So what are you doing right now? And then, make the case for amalgamation. If you think that that's what should happen in the future, I guess I'm kind of putting words in your mouth. That's what I think should happen, but maybe you disagree. So yeah, Ron, what are y'all doing? And then, what should happen next?
Well, good question. To go back to 2008 at our founding convention, at that point, we adopted a resolution and we stand by that. We have updated it and embellished upon it as recently as this past year on this whole question of coordinated bargaining. I mean, whether we like it or not, at least for the foreseeable future, we are probably stuck with these 12 or 13 different craft unions. To dismantle that system and create a brand new union, there has been attempts, that's for sure. There has been attempts to amalgamate the UTU and the BLE in the past on at least 3 occasions. 1969, the BLE decided to not join the new forming UTU and stood alone. And then around 1999, 2000, 2001, there was 2 attempts to unite the 2 unions. They came very close, but failed to amalgamate at that point. And when we think of some of the modern day problems, like the fight over maintaining the 2-person crew, which would have been a much easier fight for us to fight if we had a single union of the operating crafts, but we don't. And so, but in 2008, RWU came along and said, not only do we need a union of the BLE and the UTU, currently SMART, we need all the unions to, if not amalgamate, then at least cooperate. And so our position to this day is a universal bargaining coalition of all rail labor, particularly in national handling with the big freight carriers, but in all property agreements, including on property and freight at Amtrak, at commuter, and so forth, where there's multiple unions. They should all strategize together. They should plot in advance with meetings at the highest level. And we believe that they should sign legally binding agreements with one another, that the unions don't simply do what Nick explained. As soon as a presidential emergency board comes out, or as soon as there's a catalyst, one union jumps ship, another union jumps ship and tells their members, this is the best we can get, and we don't care about the members of those other unions, that this would not be something that would be possible, because they would be bound to support each other to the final goalpost. And so that is our idea. We are doing a petition. We are hoping that thousands of railroad workers will sign on, with the understanding that an injury to one is an injury to all. United we stand, divided we fall. And it doesn't matter what union or craft you're in. If you work for a rail carrier, you have every interest in unity and solidarity with your brothers and sisters in your fellow unions. Just because you don't pay dues to them should not amount to a hill of beans. So that's our goal. And then in terms of amalgamation, ultimately, I mean, this craft war has been going on for 150 years. RWU is just the most recent expression of various workers in different crafts and different unions who have historically tried to bridge the divide between the various craft unions. And it appears that this will go on indefinitely. And so what we would love to see, much to the chagrin of the existing trade union leadership, because none of them, since we've been organized, have ever uttered a word about the prospects for amalgamation. And don't get me wrong, it would be a real challenge when you got some unions affiliated to the Teamsters, other unions affiliated with the machinists. The Firemen and Oilers is affiliated to the SEIU. It's a hodgepodge alphabet soup of different unions, all affiliated, paying different per capitas. Everyone's got their finger in the pie, so it's easier said than done. But if you could get the leaders of the rail unions, especially the big ones, to come out in support of a brand new union and reach some kind of terms for how that union would be governed and what its bylaws would look like, I can almost guarantee you the majority of the rank and file and practically every craft would overwhelmingly vote in support of that, because we understand what a union is. Auto workers, steel workers, rubber workers, textile workers, teachers, that's a union. We don't have that in rail. We need a railroad workers union. So I think ultimately you're right, Jacob. We do need amalgamation. Whether we'll ever get there, I don't know. We can't even seem to bargain together these days. So right. It's a tough order.
And Nick, Railroad Workers United has a petition out there for rank and file railroaders to sign, basically to express their displeasure with these antics by the union officials. Explain that petition and what it's for and where folks can go to find that.
Sure. Yeah. So everybody should go to railroadworkersunited.org and check out our page on our website about coordinated bargaining. So the petition is hopefully just the start of a real campaign on this front, but we need to know, and we want to be able to demonstrate. We all have, stories of working with coworkers who say, it's so stupid that we're in two different unions. It's so stupid that we're at each other's throats. But we can't bring those, we can bring up those stories, but they're just stories, right? We need names, we need numbers, we need to be able to back this up. And so, the petition is hopefully the start of building a campaign, because while negotiations are starting in the fall, and I'm sure the carriers are hoping that they get wrapped up quickly, there's no guarantee that they do. We saw what happened with the last one. It took 3 years to get that negotiating process finalized, and it literally took an act of Congress to do it. So there's time yet to fight on this front. So we want all rank and file railroad workers, if you agree that our unions need to work together as a united front and present the biggest possible opposition to the carriers' plans for us, then sign the petition, but also join RWU. We have a coordinated bargaining coalition campaign going, where we a committee going where RWU members are working together to figure out ways to increase the pressure on our union's leaderships to work together and how to reach more railroad workers and spread the word. So we need more people. And then keep your eyes out. We've already put out some stuff about the need for coordinated bargaining. We're going to be putting out more stuff soon. We need it shared far and wide to any railroad workers you might know. There's less and less of us every year, but we need to get it out there, and hopefully we'll be able to at least, prevent this from escalating. But hopefully, like Ron and you have been talking about, we need a really big sea change in railroad labor if railroad labor is going to survive, in my opinion, let alone thrive.
Yeah. The website is railroadworkersunited.org, railroadworkersunited.org. Nick Wurst and Ron Kamenko, members of Railroad Workers United and SMART and BLET, respectively. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thanks for having us, Jacob.
All right. We're going to be keeping tabs on that. Negotiations begin in the fall, and the fall is not very far away. So Very concerning developments. Hopefully they are able to knock some sense into those folks at the top. That's just what I say.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.